I think the attraction and the engagement and the healing that comes from being outdoors is mostly universal. I think it's built into all of our DNA. None of us are so far removed from a time when we were more connected to the natural world. And often those people in communities of color are even closer to a time when they lived a more rural and pastoral life. And it's only been a generation or two, or maybe three, that there's been this urbanization and disconnection from the natural world. So I think that is a universal force. And at the same time, I think being outdoors and being in wilderness areas, especially, has been a more recent source of danger and fear in the African American and Latinx communities and the Native American communities, indigenous people communities. If you were outdoors in the woods, that's where you might just disappear. And that's where the lynchings happened in the United States. And there have been some very powerful forces that have unwelcomed communities to the outdoors. And I think those are some painful, deep wounds that need time to heal and be repaired. And they don't heal and repair on their own. I think, we need to remove some of those barriers and unwelcoming features of being outdoors. And, I'm talking about historical things like lynchings and kidnappings and things, but there are many people of color today, right now, that are part of the work that we're engaged in, who tell me stories about how unwelcome they feel in state and national parks, and how many times they've been asked, like, oh, that's why are you here? And oh, are you lost? What are you doing? So I think that some of the more subtle aspects of that kind of unconscious bias or even overt racism still exist, in addition to the historical wounds that still exist. I think what we were seeing, especially pre-pandemic, is this incredible youth activism, especially around climate change. And one of the things that I heard and read a lot from the youth activists is, we're not learning about this in our schools. We shouldn't have to find this out on our own. Like, what is it that you're not telling us? How come we can't learn about this stuff that is going to have such a huge impact on us as adults? How come we can't learn about that in school? And so I think that youth, young people, do see a connection between their activism and their, quote, schooling. And it's the schools and the schooling that doesn't see the connection as clearly, or only sees obstacles to getting there. And I think, I don't know how that will play out over time, whether the schools can be responsive enough, quickly enough to address those concerns of students. Alternatively, students have to find their opportunity to engage in those issues in out of school time. And there are a lot of out of school, after school, beyond school, summertime opportunities that are growing up as a result of students not being able to find what they're looking for during the school day. I think like with almost every issue that has emerged during the pandemic, the issues were all there before, and the pandemic made them more visible and accentuated them. So I'm thinking, like, for instance, early in the pandemic, when we were all sheltering in place, and the first few weekends of sheltering in place last spring in California, our state parks were overrun, packed and chaotically overrun, and dangerously overrun. Too many people too close together, trying to seek some kind of outdoor healing and opportunity to escape the psychological burdens of sheltering in place. And the response to that overcrowding and overwhelming of the state parks were orders saying, we're going to close down those places, close down the parking lots to all of our state parks, and we're recommending that people only go outdoors in your community, in your neighborhoods, to local parks that you can walk to. And the reality is that in communities of color, those neighborhoods were explicitly designed not to have parks and green spaces. And the outdoor spaces are not so healing and inspiring, and not so filled with fresh air and fresh water. And so this accentuated an environmental justice issue that has existed for generations, that the suburbs where rich white people live and the rural areas are the places where you can enjoy the outdoors. But if you're living in the city in a redlined community that was the only place where Black people could get a loan to buy a house, sorry, you don't have any parks there. And so this idea that the outdoors is so critically important to our health and well-being became apparent to all these people who were dying to get into the state parks. And we saw even kind of further accentuation of the injustice related to not having access to outdoors. Similarly, when schools shut down and students were and still are in remote learning and online learning exclusively, of course, families that have good high-speed internet and a device for every member of the household, and quiet rooms for every person to be in where they can hear a teacher talking to them, and an adult who doesn't have to go to work, that's not an essential worker, those students could be modestly successful in the remote learning context. And students that don't have those privileges can't possibly be successful with remote learning. And we've been advocating that the antidote to those systemic inequities that go along with remote learning is to bring kids back for in-person learning outdoors where it's safe. And you can be outdoors with a group of students and a caring, trained, highly skilled outdoor educator, and you're 20 times less of contracting the virus outside as inside. There are very many fewer surfaces that have to be wiped and cleaned. Air circulation is thousands of times better. Social distancing is much easier because there's more space available. And somehow school systems have not been able to figure out how to utilize outdoor spaces to bring kids back for in-person learning. Um, and I think this also kind of is in the category of an environmental justice issue. If there were rich white kids that were struggling with remote learning, they'd figure out how to put up a tent to block the rain and hand warmers to allow kids to come together and learn outdoors. But it's not a critical issue for the kind of privileged part of our society. And those kids that have access to remote learning and good devices and all that are also more likely to have a really nice backyard and to go on walks with their parents and to, you know, be able to get the, so like they have it all. They can do the remote learning and they have access to the outdoors. And that's not true either of those things for those vulnerable communities. Yeah, that's a great question. And it's, you know, there's a kind of a conundrum that becomes a barrier. That's like, you know, nothing I can do. I'm never going to be Black. There's nothing I can never be, you know, Latino. So am I just not the right one? Like, do I just need to step aside and make space for people who have that lived experience and that connection to those communities? And I don't know, that's one pathway. I think a lot of us, talking about like me, do need to maybe make space for educators of color to move into the spaces that we're in. But I don't think that that means that there's no place for a white man in the education system. And I think that so I have a friend, Jose Gonzalez, who's the founder of Latino Outdoors. It's an organization that takes Latino people outdoors and takes them out on hikes and picnics and community events. And he says, he told me, you don't have to be Latino to work with Latino kids. You just have to be curious about their lived experiences. Like you have to care about like what their life is like and ask them questions. And you don't have to be an expert, but you have to care about their lived experience and be curious. And, you know, that's good enough. And I think that's like, it's like so simple and profound at the same time. And I think, you know, there's a role for everybody that has a stake in the environment and improving communities and empowering people and protecting the environment. You know, any of us that care about any of those things can do a little good, you know, and we shouldn't be excluding excluding ourselves or self-selecting out because of what we're not.